Okay, we're moving on with the 1920s Cultural Diversity and Conflict, Part 2, Prohibition. All right. This is where a constitutional amendment was ratified, the 18th Amendment, which outlawed at the constitutional level the manufacture, transportation, and sale of beverage alcohol in the United States. The so called Noble Experiment. It lasted about 14 years before being repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. So how could a thing like this happen? I mean, a constitutional amendment, that's hard to do. Only 33 have ever been proposed, and over a third of those were in 1789. It takes a majority vote in both houses of Congress to propose one. It takes favorable action by three-fourths of the states to ratify one. This happened. Okay, so how did it happen? We can go back to the roots of this, which are in the early 19th century in the footsteps of the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, back in colonial times, alcohol consumption was virtually universal, and somebody figured out how, I don't know, I'm just passing it along, that the per capita, that's the average per person alcohol consumption in the United States in the 18th century was something like 3 times what it is today. Whoa. And nobody was making an issue of it. All right. At least it was not seen as a problem that government needed to solve. I mean, the preacher boys at Harvard College in the 18th century were fed beer with their breakfast. So the only way it could become an issue was not socially so much as it was individual. I mean, then as now, there'll be some people that just become ensnared by that. They lose control and they become what we would call alcoholics. In those days, they were called drunkards. It did not occur to anybody to pass a law or anything like that. It's just that if you can't handle it and you become a drunkard, you forfeit social respectability. So there you go. Now, the 19th century, as decade followed by decade, brings the Industrial Revolution. And that has an impact because the lives of factory workers were very drab, very demanding, and very hopeless. And apparently, ill effects of tobacco use spiked within, the earliest years of the Industrial Revolution, both in Britain and in America, not so much other places. So the only bright spot in a factory worker's life was the little visit to the tavern on the way home after work. And so workers, now we're projecting something like a later pattern here where the man is working and his family's not. Let's just say they probably worked at the factory too. They just got home before he did. They didn't stop by the tavern because it was a male only thing. Women and especially children never set foot in a tavern. All right, but that just lightens things up. Easy for you to say. Lightens things up and sort of lifts the burden a little bit. And that's the only bright spot in your whole life. It's something you would not let go of easily. Well, so you get home tipsy, if not drunk, and you start taking it out on your family because you're guilty because you probably drank up your wages, and bad things happen. So the ill effects were too big to ignore. So by the 1830s, when the United States was a veritable weed patch of reform movements aimed at one abuse or another, one of them was the temperance movement. Okay, temperance advocates were not. It didn't cross their minds to outlaw alcohol consumption. The government was seen more, I think, as a threat to liberty, which it is. But they were urging working class people to simply cut back, limit how much they would consume. All right, the problem, half a century later, progressives are going to see the same thing, that working class people often had hard lives. Well, reason why? It's obvious. They do not have good middle class values of sobriety and thrift and the work ethic, that sort of thing. So the cause of that seemed to be alcohol, but then that's later. So the 1830s and 40s, we have the temperance movement. It's middle class people organizing to do battle against demon rum using persuasion. There would be meetings, temperance rallies, where you get as many people in there as they could and have speakers haranguing them about drinking and having almost no success. Um, this was, maybe you could squeeze a class conflict thing out of it, but working class people were pretty much impervious to being evangelized by middle class people who they weren't giving up their drinking either. Then around the early 1840s, this flipped over. There's a story, can't verify it. It was in a textbook we used one time long ago, that there's a temperance rally going on down the street, and here's these 3 or 4 guys sitting in a bar getting all lubricated, and they were making fun of the idea of that temperance rally and decided that they would choose one of their number to go down there and break it up. So they draw straws, whatever it is. One of them got the job of going down there and breaking the rally up. So the rest of them continued their drinking. And eventually the guy comes back and he's bought into it. He has gone on the wagon. He has signed the card. So from there, the story goes, working class men who may have perceived they really did have a problem, they had a much easier time influencing each other than middle class people ever had. So while the 1930s, pardon me, let's move it back one, the 1830s may have been the most alcohol-soaked decade in American history, the 1840s, different deal, as the temperance movement spread strongly among working class people. Okay, so, but the temperance movement, along with all the others except the anti-slavery crusade, just faded out as the anti-slavery crusade in the 1850s and 60s literally breathed up all the oxygen of reform movements. That was the biggest one. Of course, we had secession, we had the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, and it was ugly, but slavery was done away with. So then the temperance movement comes back in line with the progressive era. And the progressives had this idea, as I think I told you when we got into that, they had given up on persuasion to solve problems. They thought that government power would be handier. If you could get control of the power of government, you could simply outlaw the causes of these social problems. Sadly, that is all too much with us even today. Okay? There are people who crave the power of government because they have convinced themselves that their way is the one true way, and it becomes a kind of moral imperative on them to gain enough government power to force everyone else into compliance with how they think things ought to be. Well, I said that, didn't I? As in, did I say that? A search of my memory banks reveals that I did. So the temperance movement morphs into the Prohibition movement. This was at the state level. It was political. So temperance advocates or prohibition advocates in all the states managed to pick up steam, and this became a kind of, snowball rolling down a hill, became an almost irresistible force. And states began setting up what were called local option provisions, where a county, a municipality, a precinct, a ward, whatever, could hold an election and vote to outlaw tobacco sales. But I said tobacco. You know why I said that? Because the anti-tobacco crusade of contemporary America, or just a few years ago, is the closest thing we've had. to the Prohibition movement. Outlawed alcohol sales, county by county. So this just continued to grow. We had the Anti-Saloon League, and there was another group, I think, and it got into the culture. Songs like 10 Nights in a Bar Room, or for a female vocalist, Lips That Touch Liquor Shall Never Touch Mine. But by that time, even people who really didn't have any problem with drinking are getting involved in it. Okay, I happen to live in the little town of Granbury, Texas. Okay, Granbury is unusual because of its town square, where back in the 1890s or so, when the town was very prosperous the first time around, a lot of stores were built, and in those days you could get a cast iron storefront ready-made, put on there, and it's one of the most complete collections in the country. The Granbury Square has been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1973. It's still there because by 1940 there was no longer that good a reason for the town to be there. Nobody had the money to modernize those outdated old storefronts, so they survived. Now, the reason I told you that is to tell you this. There's historical markers all over that square for every building that dates from that time, and there was a time when there was like an open saloon on each of the four sides of the square. Well, what's it like going to town on a Saturday? Can you just go to town on a Saturday without being harassed or jostled on the streets or having to step over drunks and, hey, where's your 15-year-old? Enough is enough. So World War I speeded that up. We're trying to conserve everything. And if we're asking school children to go without bread one day a week, how can we justify using perfectly good farmland to grow hops to make beer out of? Plus, beer brewers are almost unanimously German. Got to strike a blow against the Hun. So in 1919, Congress formally proposed the 18th Amendment, outlawing at the constitutional level the manufacture, transportation, and sale of beverage alcohol in the United States. And it was proposed, I think, in 1917, ratified in January 1919, and the terms of the amendment itself, it would formally take effect 1 year later in January of 1920, and it did. It's called Prohibition. But the backers of Prohibition just let go of the rope. They stood down. They have won. Season's over. They won the championship. Nobody would dare break the Constitution, would they now? Well, just maybe. So it would have taken heavy and continuous support to make this even partially successful, and that support vanished at the wrong time. It authorized Congress to implement this with legislation, so Congress passed the Volstead Act after it took effect, and the Volstead Act did something that the amendment did not. It defined alcoholic beverages. What is an alcoholic beverage? It's any beverage containing as much as 0.5% alcohol by volume. Something that weak is going to get to your bladder way before it gets to your brain. In fact, do you know what the alcohol content of vanilla flavoring is? It's something like 35%. It may be more than that. And there was a run on that particular product. So Prohibition took effect. It became less and less effective as time went by. And I'm short on what I've got left on this one. I'm going to continue this over into the next part because I'm kind of in a paragraph change here.